Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, August 12th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, clinical trials need participants. Regulators are examining whether existing rules on participant compensation are helping or getting in the way. Plus, government asks for public input all the time, but most people don't know what to do with that invitation. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The years-long North Korean remote IT worker campaign has infiltrated hundreds of companies. Now the FBI has confirmed that at least one of those individuals was found working for a federal agency. Experts say the widening campaign points to an emerging gap in national security vetting. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me with more details. Justin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
What has the FBI confirmed about this incident?
Well, the FBI has confirmed very little about this incident, but they have confirmed that one of these guys was found working for an unidentified federal agency at this point. And, you know, it's interesting. The campaign has been notorious for essentially generating funds for the North Korean regime to fund their weapons programs and things like that. But this really shifts this a little bit more into a national security espionage type issue for sure. The North Korean remote IT worker campaign, it actually came up during a July 28th conference hosted by the Digital Government Institute in Washington, D.C. Todd Hemmen, the Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's Cyber Capabilities Branch, was asked whether this threat had impacted government.
Without getting into ongoing investigations, we identified just this past week a DPRK remote IT worker that was working for the federal government. We're still kind of unpacking that recent case. It's actually a little bit baffling to me, not understanding this particular agency's process. But the short answer is yes. We are seeing remote IT workers, not just in private sector, although vastly higher proportion in the private sector, but we're also seeing this impact the government to a degree.
Wow. Do we know any more about which agency was impacted or any other details about what this might have been related to?
At this point, no. The FBI declined to comment further on the story, so we don't know what agency was impacted, how long the intrusion lasted, and whether any sensitive data was stolen or anything along those lines. It's highly likely Hemmen was referring to a remote IT employee doing contract work on behalf of an agency rather than an actual federal employee who was somehow a remote IT worker in North Korea. But such a case, as far as a contractor goes, wouldn't be unprecedented. Just last year, a Maryland man was sentenced to 15 months in prison for allowing a North Korean national in China to work on software development contracts for the Federal Aviation Administration. And the press release announcing that sentencing pointed to how this man had gained work with at least 13 U.S. companies, and several of those companies had contracted his services to U.S. government agencies in addition to the FAA. So there's been this ongoing investigation. We know that other agencies were wrapped up in this in addition to the FAA. What we don't know is how, what those other agencies, who they are, how deep this goes. But, I talked to a former FBI official who requested anonymity to speak candidly, and they said it's a natural progression for this campaign to try to get placement in government locations rather than just corporate work.
Justin, how long has this been going on? Why don't we hear more about it? And is it just North Korea, or are there other countries involved here?
Well, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies have been very focused on this North Korean IT worker scheme going back to at least 2022. Investigators say the North Korean government has dispatched thousands of highly skilled IT workers across the world to gain fraudulent employment. And the campaign is believed to have placed workers in hundreds of companies, including Fortune 500 companies in the United States. The United Nations has estimated it's generated between $250 million and $600 million annually for North Korea. And the way it works is these North Korean workers use access to company networks to steal sensitive and proprietary data, as well as sensitive IT credentials. They often are skilled in key technology areas like software, and they use forged and stolen identities, as well as third-party collaborators, oftentimes in the United States, to set up legitimate addresses and laptop farms that allow them to then VPN into the corporate networks. Artificial intelligence is also helping make this campaign more successful through increasingly realistic deepfakes, as well as AI translation tools and the ability to do quick research using AI to be a better worker. So all that has kind of been happening over the last 4 years and really building and building.
Is there any guidance out now from the FBI or Homeland Security or whoever might be the right organization for government agencies and contractors to take action now to preclude this kind of incident in the future?
There's been a lot of guidance put out there in some of these FBI alerts, and actually the State Department just led a global alert with at least more than a dozen other foreign partner agencies about this specific North Korean IT worker threat. And what they say is generally look out for things like frequent changes in registered information, such as account names, contact details, and bank account information. Also, you look for multiple accounts for using the same identification document. Check those identification documents really closely to see if it's been forged or altered using image editing software. And then in the hiring process, there might be discrepancies that appear in video conference meetings. They might refuse to participate in video conference meetings and only want to do audio. And then they also might offer to work for rates lower than the general market rate. So if it sounds like it's too good of a deal to be true, it just might be as far as that skilled remote IT worker.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for bringing us this story.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
And you can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, clinical trials need participants. Regulators are examining whether existing rules on participant compensation are helping or getting in the way. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The HHS Office of Inspector General is seeking public input on how fraud and abuse laws affect payments to clinical trial participants. The effort could help determine whether existing rules strike the right balance between protecting patients and supporting medical research. Joining me now is Spencer Turnbull, Chief of the Industry Guidance Branch at HHS OIG. Spencer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Terry. I'm very happy to be here.
Your office recently put out a request for information on payments to clinical trial participants. That's an interesting topic and one probably that most people don't talk about very often. But what is it about what's going on now that is of interest to you, and why are you taking a fresh look at the issue?
We issued this request for information, or RFI, because we want to improve our understanding of how clinical trials are providing remuneration to trial participants, and to learn whether the federal anti-kickback statute is viewed as a barrier to providing appropriate remuneration to those participants. For us, getting curious and posing questions to our stakeholders is one of the most effective ways for my office, which is the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS OIG, to fulfill our role in considering new safe harbors under the kickback statute. And if I might, Terry, I know I've used at least 3 technical sounding terms, and I would love to briefly explain what each of them means for our listeners who might not be steeped in healthcare law. Would that be okay with you?
Please do that. I have some questions myself, so you go with your definitions and we'll see if anything else is left on my list.
Great. Well, these are really at the heart of the RFI that we're discussing. You might know that HHS-OIG is at the forefront of America's efforts to fight waste, fraud, and abuse in HHS programs. But you may not have heard of the federal anti-kickback statute. I might just call it the kickback statute for short, but this is one of HHS-OIG's most powerful tools to deter and prosecute fraud. The kickback statute is a criminal law, and it prohibits the knowing and willful payment of remuneration, that's anything of value, to induce or reward referrals of federal healthcare program business. And that means things like prescription drugs, medical supplies, or healthcare services for Medicare or Medicaid patients. You know, in some industries, it's acceptable to reward those who refer business to you, but healthcare paid for with our tax dollars is another matter. So imagine you are sick and you go to your doctor who tells you that you need a prescription. Now imagine that a drug manufacturer has promised to give your doctor expensive concert tickets for every 50 scripts he writes for their drug. Will your doctor be prescribing you the drug that's in your clinical best interest or the drug that will earn him concert tickets? So the kickback statute stands guard against that kind of corruption of medical decision-making. I also use the word remuneration a couple of times. In the kickback statute, that just means anything of value. It could be cash, it could be something like free rent or expensive meals or excessive compensation. And here in the clinical trial context, it could mean help with someone's copayments or a travel reimbursement. So the last term I wanted to touch on is safe harbor, which is again at the core of the RFI we are discussing. A safe harbor under the kickback statute protects certain payment and business practices from kickback liability, where that practice could otherwise implicate the statute. Safe harbors are voluntary. Their provisions have been developed to limit the reach of the kickback statute by permitting certain non-abusive arrangements while encouraging beneficial or innocuous arrangements. And that sort of brings us back to this RFI, which is seeking feedback from our stakeholders on whether a safe harbor for clinical trial remuneration is needed, and if so, what such a safe harbor should protect.
That was hugely helpful, and you ticked off all three definitions I wanted to follow up on, so thank you for that. But now let's talk about a safe harbor. What would that actually look like if you were going to put it into place?
That's a great question, and it's really at the heart of this request for information. OIG doesn't know the answer yet, but we want to find out by hearing from clinical trial stakeholders. And besides asking the public to weigh in on that particular question of what one might look like, we also want to ask and have asked some related questions, including what are the types and amounts of remuneration that are currently being provided to trial participants, and what types of remuneration would folks like to provide that maybe they're not sure whether they can. We'd also like to know about some of the fraud and abuse risks that might be associated with providing remuneration to participants, and people's ideas for safeguards that are necessary or prudent to prevent fraud and abuse when participants are receiving remuneration.
Spencer Turnbull is the chief of the Industry Guidance Branch at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General. So, Spencer, if we step back now from the details of specific arrangements, it seems like at the simplest level, maybe you're weighing two concerns. On the one hand, researchers want to make participation easier and they want to get people in the door. On the other, regulators don't want financial incentives driving medical decisions. So where do you and the OIG sit and evaluate that balance? How do you know if it's shifted too far in one direction or the other?
Terry, that's such a great critical question for the work that we do. In the context of the RFI, I can speak to OIG's general approach when developing new safe harbors for the anti-kickback statute. Writing an effective safe harbor begins with understanding the landscape of the issue it purports to address. And it would be a missed opportunity to create a safe harbor that doesn't get used because it doesn't reflect the reality of conducting clinical trials. That's why we're soliciting feedback from stakeholders on several different facets of remuneration provided to clinical trial participants. Questions like the benefits of enrolling federal healthcare program beneficiaries in particular into clinical trials. What are the barriers to enrollment that trial sponsors are facing? And what are the types of remuneration that are effective? What are the risks that must be managed, et cetera? So were OIG to decide to draft a proposed safe harbor, we would be balancing benefits against risks, as you noted, asking questions like, would the arrangements protected by the new safe harbor increase or decrease access to healthcare services? Would they increase or decrease quality of healthcare services? Increase or decrease patient freedom of choice or costs to federal healthcare programs? So those are just a few examples of the lenses through which we consider potential new safe harbors and how we conduct that balance.
And is there a concern in this kind of situation that if the payments become too generous, they might actually affect the research by influencing who participates in the study, how the study is conducted, or why people participate in the first place?
Well, that is actually outside the scope of our RFI. But what I can tell you is that OIG will focus on our responsibility, which is to carefully evaluate the need for new safe harbors to the kickback statute and to carefully craft any new safe harbors to protect beneficial arrangements that pose a low risk of fraud and abuse.
And comments on your request for information are due by August 24th. What kind of information would be most useful for you as you're looking for evidence that supports one side or the other here?
Well, I hope that commenters will provide real-world examples, data, and of course, their perspectives that illustrate how payment practices are functioning today. We're especially interested in areas where clarity, a new safe harbor, or a modification to existing regulations could support responsible research participation while maintaining strong protections against fraud and abuse. So, depending on what we learn, potential next steps could include updated guidance, rulemaking, or other efforts to modernize how fraud and abuse frameworks apply in clinical research.
As industry folks might be responding to this, is there a tension between what they want to communicate to you so that the safe harbor rules get written effectively and what they might sort of be confessing in that process?
Of course, I can't speak for how our commenters approach the RFI, but based on our experience, RFIs usually generate candid, useful information. And of course, we'll consider everything that we receive and are grateful for those submissions.
Spencer Turnbull is the chief of the Industry Guidance Branch at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Terry, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, OPM has spent the past year helping reshape the federal workforce. A new GAO report looks at what's happened inside OPM itself. But first, government asks for public input all the time. Most people do not know what to do with that invitation. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Federal agencies depend on public comments when they write and revise regulations. But many citizens and subject matter experts have very little experience participating in the process. A new effort aims to help people understand how agencies evaluate comments and what makes them useful. Here with more is Colette Delawala, founder of the Stand Up for Science Foundation. Colette, it is so nice to have you. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Stand Up for Science is doing something really interesting. You are convening 2 rapid response workshops to help individuals and organizations draft comments in response to a National Science Foundation proposal to update proposal and award policies and procedures guide. You wouldn't be doing that, it seems to me, if people already knew how to do this. So
That's right.
What are the biggest gaps that you're trying to fill through these workshops?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just that people need awareness that this is a part of the American democratic process, that this is our government asking for feedback, they're asking for information. And in this way, yes, the lowest rung on the bar is to vote. But this is sort of the next step up, right? It gives people the opportunity to share their expertise in areas that they have a lot of expertise in a way that can make an impact in how the government works, and particularly how the government works sort of in their sphere or in an area that impacts them. So first thing is driving awareness. The second thing is making sure that people are armed with the know-how for how to write a comment that does affect change. And of course, there's sort of two ways to go about it, right? The first thing is just writing a comment, even if the comment is a couple sentences long that says, I don't like this is un-American, or I don't like this, and here's the reason why. That is really important because it in and of itself draws attention to the matter, which we've seen with the OMB, uniform guidance rule, that actually that attention really does matter if it's happening substantially. But the other thing is that there are some really specific, frankly, easy things that you can do to add some power and some punch to your public comments. And we want to make sure that people have the toolkit to do that, not just for this public comment, but for any that come down the line and they realize, oh, I'm the person that could answer, this call for commentary.
I'm wondering what you find as you talk to folks here, because I suspect that the average American, one, probably doesn't know that they have this opportunity, but two, if they do know about it, might think that it's either irrelevant because no one pays attention anyway, or two, that it's something best left to the professionals. What kind of are the biggest misconceptions here?
I think it's exactly those two things, right? Especially the best left to the professionals. And I think that people often discredit their own expertise and their own experiences as being unimportant. Like we think that, oh, well, I've only received a grant from the NSF. I'm not an expert on grant funding. Well, if you've received a grant from the NSF, you're a participant and you have something to say about what is in this new, this proposal, this proposed rule. It will impact you. And so you should talk about how it would impact you if XYZ things were passed through. So I think that there is just this tendency for people, I think especially scientists, to really discount themselves and to say, well, I'm not really an expert in this area. It's like, no, like you've received several grants from this agency. Like you actually know way more about it than the average person does.
What happens when an agency gets these comments? How do they separate ones that are genuinely influential from ones that they go, oh, yep, and they put it in a pile?
Well, so the first thing is to note the usual way of doing things versus how this administration is doing things. So I do want to make that distinction. In times past, what would happen is you'd have a team of one or two, folks at that agency who would read, like a person, a human being, would read all of the comments and would separate out the ones that maybe it's just hey, this is un-American, I don't like it, or, protect the Keystone Pipeline. Like that was a big one that had a large response. And then there are ones that cite specific parts of the proposal that say, that use this very special word. It is reliant. So are you reliant? Is your lab, are you as a, in your career reliant? Are your students reliant? Do you have employees who are reliant on funding or structures or something about what is being changed in this rule or proposed to be changed in the rule? And being able to really directly tie in, if the government does this is how it will impact me and my situation. And being able to tie that directly to provisions that are outlined in these documents are sort of what separates a good or impactful comment from one that is less impactful. Also, organizations have sort of a higher rank standing than individuals. So, for example, Federal News Network could do, some public comments. Those would be higher ranked or sort of land in a different place in the ranking compared to just an individual.
Colette Dalawala is the founder and CEO of the Stand Up for Science Foundation. Colette, let's follow that a little farther. You talked earlier about scientists really not thinking that they had standing or value in submitting these. If they don't, if citizens and subject matters don't submit their comments on rules like you're engaged in right now, who winds up having the most influence over the rules agencies write?
The people who are in power, the people who are overseeing those agencies. It ends up sort of falling by default to the leadership of the agency. They have the ultimate say-so in this, but there has in the past been a much greater respect for the expertise that the public brings in these public comment openings. It's the reason why they do it, because they want to hear what the public has to say. They want to hear how, it's sort of like finding blind spots. That's how I think about this is it's like, okay, the government has thought out a rule that they think is going to work, but they're not in the lab. They're not in the building. They're not, in your email inbox having to deal with the fallout of the changes that would result from this rule. And so it's sort of the government asking, all right, what blind spots, what plot holes do you see with what we're recommending? If you don't give the plot holes to the government, they cannot account for those plot holes. And then when you're mad that there are plot holes, you can't really you had an opportunity to call it out before it came into contact. So I say that to make the point that yes, it is going to be the leadership of the agency that ultimately make decisions. And traditionally, we have seen that they have considered, and they're legally required to consider these public comments. Now, I will say, in a time when we're less maybe trusting of the leadership of these agencies and whether they're operating in goodwill, these public comments set up grounds for future litigation to stop anything in the rule that may be causing harm to, various people or institutions.
You held your first one of these rapid response workshops on July 31st. What did you hear there? Anything surprising from the participants?
I don't think it's anything. We didn't hear anything surprising in that one. I think that because we heard a lot of surprising things in our OMB rule rapid hours that we did through the month of July, June, and first part of July. And really, to me, the most surprising thing is people just not thinking that they're experts or thinking that they have nothing to add to this conversation. And anytime folks who have experience with these agencies think to themselves or say out loud, oh, I don't have anything to add to this. Yes, you do. You absolutely do. And that is, if there's one take-home message that I could send everybody off with, it is that if you have ever engaged with any of these agencies, you have something to add to the conversation.
And you've got one more workshop coming up on this coming Friday, August 14th, specifically related to the NSF rule, and the comment period there runs through August 24th. So yes. You just mentioned your key takeaway, to remember that you have something to add to the conversation. But with regard to this specific rule, are you looking for any specific or technical feedback?
Yeah, I do think that there are certainly some specific points. So I would encourage folks to highlight that enacting this rule as it is written ahead of the OMB rule being enacted, which has been paused until December, would violate the procedures that typically go along with this, right? So any sort of complying in advance, we might say, or obeying in advance, in this particular instance is illegal. And so I would encourage people to make that point. And they can make that point by calling out there are specific lines or sections in this, and we'll go over which sections they are in the NSF proposed rule that hearken to the OMB proposed rule and sort of preemptively implement these changes at the NSF. And that cannot stand. That absolutely cannot stand. And so the more pushback that we have on that particular point, I think the better.
Colette Delawala is the founder and CEO of the Stand Up for Science Foundation. Colette, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, OPM has spent the past year helping reshape the federal workforce. A new GAO report looks at what happened inside OPM itself. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. OPM has played a central role in shaping federal workforce policy over the last 18 months. At the same time, the agency itself has undergone substantial staffing reductions. A new GAO report examines what those changes could mean for OPM's ability to carry out its mission and support other agencies. Joining me to walk through the details is Dawn Locke, Director in GAO's Strategic Issues team. Dawn, thank you so much for joining me. It's lovely to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me, Terry.
You've done a recent analysis of workforce changes at OPM, and it's so interesting. For the last year and a half or so, OPM's really been one of the principal architects of federal workforce change, and yet your report finds that OPM itself lost about 35% of its own workforce during that same time period. It seems like OPM is essentially becoming a case study in its own workforce policies.
That is true. What I can say about this is that OPM obviously wasn't immune to the recent workforce changes. In 2025, we know that across the federal government, there was a decline about 11% of the workforce. But OPM had a decline, as you know, of 34%, which is well above that average. So what this means is that they're going to need to assess what skills and knowledge gaps this created in order to keep fulfilling their mission. And as for the case study, yes, because OPM was unresponsive to our request, we remain interested in seeing whether this was an effective decision or if these workforce losses will have negative consequences.
Well, let's drill into some of the specifics about what you were able to observe. That 35% reduction translates to a little bit more than 1,000 people. When GAO looked at those changes, what did you notice about the people who left OPM between that time frame, December 24 and March 26?
Sure. So we noticed that the majority of the people who were hardest hit were those over 60 years old and those under 30 years old. And this is important because almost 60% of people over the age of 60 were separated. And this is massive institutional knowledge going out the door. Whereas when you look at the 40% that were separated who are under the age of 30 years old, that is a solid pipeline that is now being let go of. And what's interesting is that the administration has made hiring youth and emerging career professionals a priority. So it's really difficult to understand why the youth were so drastically impacted. And it wasn't just at OPM, it was across the federal government.
When you look at those changes, what really concerns you more? Is it the size of the reduction, the loss of the institutional experience that you talk about there, or the concentration of departures, maybe in particular segments of OPM?
Sure. So I would say that the concern isn't the number of people or the shuffling of offices. It's whether OPM can still meet mission need. And for years, GAO and even OPM's own IG have identified skills gaps as an existing issue and top management challenge for OPM. So really, Terry, it's one thing for an agency to decrease its workforce and reorganize. It's a whole other thing to make changes that may decrease capability. So it's really important for OPM and all of us to understand the impact of what's happened.
As you describe those impacts, OPM is a customer-facing organization. They're not just a policy shop. So federal employees interact with them in lots of different ways: hiring, classification, retirement. If OPM's operational capacity is weakened, as you sort of described here, where do you think agencies and employees will feel or see it first?
Truly, we have no indication of where the impact would be first felt. Certainly, OPM's remaining employees would feel it, as would OPM's customers. But of course, as mentioned, at this point, we don't know the details of how OPM is reorganizing or how it's leveraging the staff left to ensure continued customer service.
Dawn Locke is a director in GAO's Strategic Issues team. Dawn, you've been very clear to point out the challenges with figuring out the strategic balance of what's left in OPM. And the case study gives a really interesting example, the case of the Merit System Accountability and Compliance Shop that lost 41% of its FTEs over this time frame that we're talking about. And yet, as we've watched new guidance come out from OPM over the last 18 months, the same time frame, they have been consolidating more and more and more responsibilities to that shop in terms of reviewing merit system claims and cases. Is this an example of where the strategic balance looks out of whack? What are you finding there?
Well, from the outside looking in, it certainly does look out of whack. It's hard to understand how they can reduce some of these offices so drastically and increase the responsibility of those offices at the same time. But again, we're not sure to what extent they're moving around staff or how they're strategically going to accomplish some of the demands that are coming from these offices. And that's why it's important for us to get in there and see what they're doing.
What kind of information did you all ask for that OPM was unwilling or unable to provide?
So we asked for a number of things. For example, we asked for information regarding strategic workforce plans. We asked for their staffing plans. We also asked for their agency RIF and reorganization plan. And this plan is important because it's a plan that lays out how workforce reductions have impacted agencies as well as any potential cost savings. But we were not able to receive those documents. I will say, Terry, though, that the day that this report was issued, OPM did send some of the information that we had requested that same afternoon, but unfortunately, it didn't include some of those key documents that we were hoping for.
They did provide some explanation, though, about how this was all going to work. And the same answer, or the answer that they provided, is one we see in a lot of agencies as well. AI is going to solve this problem. When you at GAO get that kind of a response, especially to such a dramatic workforce reduction, what's your first inclination? Is that going to solve the problem?
Sure. Well, let me first say that we haven't specifically looked at OPM occupations to know which would be good candidates for AI. We haven't done that work yet. But based on GAO's work looking at artificial intelligence in the workforce in general, what's important to keep in mind is that AI isn't something that can be jumped into quickly. It can get things wrong. It can get things really wrong. So if OPM or other agencies are going to leverage AI, they need a skilled workforce that knows how to identify when AI is making mistakes. In addition, one of my GAO colleagues who specializes in IT continues to hone into me that machines can't be held accountable, so they shouldn't be making important decisions. And as you know, OPM has to make millions of important decisions every day. So when using AI, it's critical to have humans in the loop to identify those hallucinations, especially on decisions that would be difficult to undo. So although AI could help OPM, it may not be the ultimate answer to all their staffing challenges.
Those are key points around accountability, especially when you're dealing with human information, which can be so variable. Let's go back to the skills gaps question. You've been watching these in OPM for a long time. What are the most obvious skill gaps that you've had record of, and what will you be watching for in the future?
Sure. So skills gaps have been on our high-risk list, as I said, for a very long time, especially in areas like project management, leadership development. They also have skills gaps in organizational performance and data analytics. And as you can imagine, these gaps put OPM at significant risk of being unable to meet some of its goals. So when looking at the future of work at OPM, it'll be essential for them to determine how they can adjust for these gaps to meet mission need.
And if Congress wanted to evaluate whether OPM's workforce reductions were succeeding or failing, or even the broader government-wide workforce reductions that this administration has pursued, what evidence should it demand over the next year?
Yeah, so I'll just take you back to the OMB and OPM required plans. They're, again, called the agency RIF and reorganization plans. And these are critical to seeing how workforce reductions have impacted mission as well as the cost savings of these changes. So Congress is very aware of them, and we're working with Congress now to determine next steps. And we're hopeful for more collaboration and timeliness with OPM in future work.
Now that you at least have some information, even though it wasn't in time to evaluate and publish when you put this summary out, will you be looking to share a follow-up?
So the information that was provided, unfortunately, I don't think is enough to really do a follow-up, but it will spur more questions for us. We will share it with Congress and, just, like I said, determine next steps.
Dawn Locke is a director in GAO's Strategic Issues team. Dawn, I really appreciate you joining us and walking through this information today.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview and a link to this report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Small Business Administration finalized new rules for the 8A Business Development Program in record time. In 60 days, SBA went from proposal to reviewing more than 100 comments to final regulation that will transform the 73-year-old program. For more on what's in the new 8A regulations and why some experts remain concerned about the program's long-term viability, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller joins me now. Jason, great to have you.
Thanks, Terry.
What are the new 8A program regulations? What do they say?
The new regulations now have 3 requirements for really small businesses to apply for the program. And remember, Terry, this program has gone through a whole assortment of change over the last decade, really over the last 5 years. And the last 18 months during the Trump administration, it's really been a focus on changing and transforming this program. So these regulations really are the next step of what we've seen over the last 18 months. So what do they say? First, a person or a small business owner must self-attest that they are a member of a particular group that has faced public or private sector discrimination or bias based on actions, policies, rules, regulations, or other practices. Second, the person, again, self-attestation that they have suffered, quote-unquote, material harm. Now, this means they faced a loss of access to or diminished opportunities related to economic advancement. So think of loans, financing, or even contract awards. And now, third one, and this is the big change, they have to establish social disadvantaged. Now, again, this is a very significant change from where they were. So 10 years ago, 15 years ago, over the last multiple years of the program, a small business owner just had to be a member of a group, African American, a Hispanic American, where there was a presumption of social disadvantage. They didn't have to really prove their status. They just had to say, hey, I'm a member of this group, therefore I am perceived as socially disadvantaged. Then we had the Supreme Court decision in 2023, and that changed with SBA rules. It said, okay, now you have to rebut. You have to explain why, through a narrative, why you are a socially disadvantaged person. And that then now has changed for a third time. And through this new regulation, the person really has to say, okay, now they have to show evidence. So specific actions, policy, again, rules, regulations, other practices where the government or a private entity had favored or disfavored a particular group that caused, again, them harm. Maybe unlawful affirmative action programs or policies, SBA says, maybe race-based quotas, set-asides, hiring targets. They basically say anything that would favor one race or one group over another. Now, this final rule takes effect September 10th, so there's time for you to kind of understand it. But really, these are the 3 big changes about how the 8A program will work.
And those are pretty significant. How different are they at this point in the final regulations than they were in the proposed rule?
There are some changes, but probably not as many changes as many experts and others would have liked. Now, I talked to Sam Lee. He's a former SBA Director of Policy Planning and Liaison, Director of Procurement Policy. He says a couple things that the SBA did change. They expanded what evidence the applicant could use to prove social disadvantage. He goes, that was a good sign that they kind of listened to some of the commenters. They got over 100 comments, and some of the commenters said, hey, what you're asking for will be difficult. You should kind of look at this from a broader perspective. So they did. Lee says the SBA also clarified some other concerns, such as would women-owned small business owners still be able to apply and prove social disadvantage? In the proposal, they mentioned racial or cultural bias, but they didn't mention sex as a category of discrimination. So the final rule, SBA specifically says women-owned small businesses can apply using sex discrimination as a factor. Now, another big change that he highlighted would whether or not current 8A firms, so these are firms in the program today, would they have to reapply under these new regulations? SBA says they would not need to reapply when the new regs take effect, which is, I think, a little bit of a relief for some firms. And we'll get into maybe why it's maybe not a huge relief for everyone in a second. I also talked to other experts, and they say, well, these changes are superficial at best. I talked to Anna Sanders. She's the Director of Certification Eligibility at GovCon Pros, a small business consulting firm that a lot of their clients are 8A firms. And she believes that SBA really is turning, with these changes to regulations, SBA is turning the 8A program into just another small business set-aside program. Basically, they're lowering the bar for compliance in many ways, and then they're raising it in other ways. Let me give you an example. For many years, obviously, this program was focused on minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and that bar now is much higher. She says, for instance, Terry, go find me a regulation where it says, hey, we're not going to allow women in our program, right? But on the other hand, she says that you can probably find regulations over the last 20, 25 years where specifically people who are white were not allowed in the 8A program. And they could use that to say, hey, I was discriminated against. I should belong in this program now. I'm socially disadvantaged. So hence why they're kind of raising the bar in some ways and lowering it in others. And I think that was a big concern in the proposed rule, where they really called out how people who are white were potentially discriminated against. And this is trying to fix some wrongs of the past. And I think that's a big concern. I also talked to John Shiraka, who's the chairman of GovConPros, and he's a former SBA Associate Administrator of Government Contracting and Business Development. He actually ran the 8A program for many years. And John looked at this regulations in a couple ways. First of all, he goes, these new regulations came out so quickly, he felt like a lot of what they wanted was predetermined. In all his years of looking at regulations, he's never seen it go from proposal to reviewing comments to final in 60 days. And then this final also includes going through the White House and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. Things tend to take a long time in OIRA. So he believes the administration was just, they knew what they wanted to do and they were getting out the door no matter what the commenter said. So he believes the changes are, again, superficial at best. He also pointed, and I think this is important, is they are removing the regs in terms of what that presumption is, okay, that you are socially disadvantaged. And he, highlighted the same thing. Go find me evidence where someone wrote down, hey, we don't want to work with African Americans, or we don't want to work with women-owned businesses or Hispanic or Asian-owned firms. You're just not going to find that. So complying will be a lot harder. And then finally, one of the big changes are, yes, they comment on women-owned businesses, saying that they can be part of a class or a discrimination, but they don't really add the language as sex discrimination to the rules. So in the end, will people pay attention to that closely enough? And I think those are some of the things that stood out to them as they really make any real changes.
Jason, we've got a few weeks until implementation. Are there big unanswered questions still on the table that folks hope SBA might explain between now and then?
I think the biggest one is regarding current 8A firms. Both John Shiraka and Anna Sanders said, yes, currently they're fine. But what happens when their recertification comes up? And that recertification happens on your anniversary of being accepted into the program. So, for instance, yes, September 10th, you're good, or September 11th, you're fine. But what if your recertification is November 1st or February 5th? What happens then? Do you have to prove your social disadvantage? Because if you say, if you self-certify that, yes, I have met all the requirements of the 8A program, well, those requirements have changed. And therefore, have you really met the requirements, or are you putting yourself at risk? So I think that's one of the big questions that remains unanswered is currently, yes, you're fine if you're in the 8A program. But when you have to recertify yourself, what does that mean?
So what should we be watching for after September 10th when the regulations take effect, beyond that recertification question?
I think there's a couple things. First of all, does Capitol Hill get involved? And how quickly do they get involved once they see some impact on small businesses? Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, the ranking member of the House Small Business Committee, she says this final rule brushes aside a plurality of commenters who warned the agency that they were making a big mistake. They trade clear standards for confusion and offloads oversight on their self-certification. And I think that's a big concern. She believes that because SBA has gutted their own capacity to review anything because of the workforce changes, this will result in a less than uniform standard. And I think it was really going to hurt contracting opportunities in the marketplace. She and another congressman introduced a Protect the 8A Participants bill earlier in the summer, and that would really change a lot of disruptive, what she calls regulatory changes, compliance burdens, and abrupt terminations in the small business contracting world. So I think she's pushing on her bill. Whether there's any Republican support, we'll wait and see. I also heard from Senator Ed Markey. He's, again, ranking member of the upper chambers Small Business Committee, and he, too, is very concerned about how quickly they were able to SBA finalize the proposed rule. And he believes that there'll be a lot of impact on 8A programs, and they're actually, he believes, the SBA is creating additional barriers that will undermine small businesses and the participation in federal contracts. So I think that's one thing to watch. The other thing, which is real quick, Terry, I would say to watch is how quickly SBA turns back on the 8A program, and people who have been applying and waiting on their applications. Those folks who applied 6 months ago, a year ago, that have been waiting all this time will have to reapply under these new rules. And how quickly will SBA update their platform to address these new rules? Will that take longer and add a pause to the current 8A program? And then once you do reapply, how quickly will you get approved? So I think right now there's been 0 new 8A firms approved in almost a year. So I think the last one was sometime in August of 2025. We're heading up to that year mark. And currently, Sam Lee told me he looked at the data on the 8A programs just recently and found that the number of 8A contractors dropped from about 4,300 in the start of 2026 down to 3,100 today, about 25% decrease.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for bringing us this story. There's obviously going to be a lot to watch over the next few weeks.
So much to watch over the next year. Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.